Dust plumed in the distance. A solitary rider approaching the hastily assembled camp. Wade Carson, leaning against the sturdy spokes of the chuck wagon, squinted into the afternoon sun. The air was thick with the scent of pine and anticipation. The herd was gathered, the men restless, and all that remained was the arrival of their new cook. He'd hired her sight unseen, based on a letter of recommendation from a distant acquaintance, a gamble he usually avoided. But good cooks were rarer than gold nuggets on the open range. As the rider drew closer, Wade straightened, his usual stoic expression flickering with surprise. It wasn't the grizzled old man he'd half expected, but a woman. She sat tall in the saddle, her form graceful despite the practical, trail-worn clothes. A wide-brimmed hat shaded most of her face, but not enough to conceal the striking beauty that even a layer of trail dust couldn't obscure. Her dark hair, braided and tucked, hinted at a rich, deep color. Wade felt a familiar prickle of unease. A woman on the trail, especially one as captivating as this, was an invitation to trouble. He watched her dismount with practiced ease, her boots barely disturbing the dry earth. She led her horse to the water trough, a quiet confidence in her movements. "Ma'am," Wade rumbled, stepping forward, his voice a low gravel. "Wade Carson, you must be Nora Bell." She turned, and the full impact of her presence hit him. Her eyes, a startling shade of hazel, met his with the directness that both disarmed and intrigued him. A faint, almost imperceptible scar traced a line just above her left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection that somehow enhanced her allure. "Mr. Carson," she replied, her voice soft but clear, like the chime of a distant bell. "Pleased to meet you." Around the camp, the low hum of cowboy chatter had died down, replaced by a stunned silence. Then the grumbling began, like distant thunder. "A woman cook," one burly cowboy, Jeb, muttered, loud enough for Wade to hear. "She ain't gonna last a week out here." Another, Slim, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Looks like she belongs in a parlor, not slinging hash for 100 hungry men." Wade's jaw tightened. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the men. "She's the cook," he stated, his voice flat, leaving no room for argument. "And she'll be treated with respect. Anyone got a problem with that can ride on back to town." His eyes, usually warm brown, had hardened to flint. The grumbling ceased, though the skeptical glances at Nora continued. Privately, Wade shared some of their concerns. This drive was a long, brutal haul, stretching across unforgiving terrain, through possible storms and even raids. It wasn't a place for the faint of heart, and Nora Bell, for all her quiet strength, still seemed too delicate for the harsh realities of the trail. But his word was his bond, and he'd hired her. He'd just have to keep a closer eye on things than usual. Nora, seemingly oblivious to the scrutiny, methodically began to unload her gear. She moved with an efficiency that surprised Wade. Within minutes, the side of the chuck wagon was transformed. Pots and pans emerged, glinting in the sunlight. A fire was coaxed to life with surprising speed. The aroma of brewing coffee soon mingled with the scent of bacon, sizzling in a heavy cast-iron skillet. As twilight began to paint the western sky in hues of orange and purple, the first call for supper went out. The men, still wary, formed a line, their tin plates held expectantly. Nora, her sleeves rolled up, her face flushed from the heat of the fire, served them with a quiet grace. Wade took his plate, filled with thick slices of perfectly cooked bacon, fluffy biscuits, and a generous dollop of beans, still bubbling from the pot. He found a spot on a fallen log and took a bite. His eyes widened slightly. The biscuit was light as a cloud, the bacon perfectly crisp, and the beans, seasoned with a subtle blend of spices, were unlike any he'd tasted on the trail. A low murmur of approval rippled through the hungry cowboys. Even Jeb, who'd been the loudest critic, grunted in satisfaction. Throughout the meal, Nora moved tirelessly, refilling coffee cups, keeping the fire stoked, and ensuring everyone had enough. She didn't engage in small talk, her focus entirely on her work. By the time the last plate was scraped clean, the initial skepticism had begun to melt away, replaced by a grudging respect. Wade watched her clean up, her movements precise and unhurried despite the growing darkness. The glow of the firelight caught the curve of her cheek, the determined set of her jaw. He still had his worries, plenty of them. But as he finished his second cup of coffee, a strange thought settled in his mind. Maybe, just maybe, Nora Bell was exactly what this cattle drive needed. He just hoped she wouldn't break beneath the strain, or worse, become a target. The trail had a way of revealing a person's true mettle, and sometimes it revealed more than they wanted to share. And Nora Bell, he suspected, had secrets. First storm, first strength. The sky, a brilliant, unforgiving blue just hours before, curdled to an ominous bruise. A strange, metallic tang filled the air, a precursor to the storm that had been brewing on the horizon all afternoon. Wade, his hat pulled low, had been watching the darkening clouds with a familiar unease. This wasn't just a shower. This was going to be a squall. He barked orders, his voice cutting through the rising wind, urging the men to batten down anything not bolted to the prairie. Tents were secured, gear stowed, and the cattle, sensing the change, grew restless. Nora, her movements economical and precise even in the gathering gloom, was already securing the chuck wagon. She tied down the canvas flaps, her hands nimble as she worked the knots. A sudden, violent gust ripped through the camp, tearing at the wagon's cover, threatening to flip the entire structure. The heavy canvas billowed like a sail, straining at its ropes. "Hold her!" Wade yelled, sprinting towards the wagon with a few of his men. The wooden wheels were lifting precariously on one side. He grabbed a thick rope, throwing the coiled end towards Nora. "Tie it off to that hitching post, quick!" Without hesitation, Nora caught the rope, her fingers closing around it with surprising strength. She didn't flinch from the lashing rain that now began to fall, cold and stinging. With a grunt, she pulled the rope taut, wrapping it around the sturdy post. Her biceps, surprisingly defined beneath her simple dress, flexed with the effort. Wade watched, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, as she braced her feet, digging them into the muddy ground, and hauled on the rope, steadying the listing wagon alongside the men. Her hair, escaped from its neat bun, whipped around her face, plastered to her skin by the deluge, but her gaze remained fixed on the task, resolute. The wagon groaned but held. The storm escalated with a ferocious intensity. Lightning tore jagged paths across the sky, followed by ear-splitting thunder that vibrated through the very ground. Rain fell in sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet. The cattle, a dark, churning mass in the distance, lowed nervously. Wade, soaked to the bone, was making his rounds, checking on the men and the herd. He spotted Nora near the makeshift corral, her silhouette stark against the flashing sky. A young mare, newly broken and particularly skittish, was rearing and plunging in a frenzy of terror. Her whinnies were shrill, desperate. The other horses were agitated, their eyes rolling white. Nora, instead of seeking shelter, had moved towards the terrified animal. She spoke to it in low, soothing tones, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. Wade paused, shielded by the partial cover of a small rise, watching. He expected her to be swatted aside, or worse, but Nora, with a quiet confidence that defied the chaos, slowly extended a hand. The mare shied, snorting, but Nora didn't retreat. She kept talking, her voice a steady balm in the tempest. Inch by agonizing inch, she closed the distance. Then, with a gentle, deliberate movement, she laid her hand on the mare's neck. The horse trembled violently, its muscles taut, but it didn't pull away. Nora stroked its wet mane, murmuring reassurances. Another blinding flash of lightning, another deafening crack of thunder. The mare flinched, but this time it pressed its head into Nora's shoulder, seeking comfort. She held the animal, her arms wrapped loosely around its neck, a still point of calm amidst the raging storm. It was a remarkable display of quiet courage and innate understanding. Wade felt a strange tightening in his chest. He'd seen plenty of men break horses, but he'd never witnessed such a tender yet utterly commanding display of connection in the face of such raw power. The image of Nora, drenched and resolute, calming the panicked mare, etched itself into his mind. It wasn't just her physical strength with the wagon. It was this deep, quiet grit that resonated. The storm might have been raging outside, but within the confines of his own thoughts, a different kind of storm was beginning to brew. He had hired a cook, a woman who had, against all odds, proven herself capable. But Nora Bell was more than just capable. She was something else entirely. And Wade, for the first time since she arrived, realized he had absolutely no idea what he was truly dealing with. A shadow of fear. The dawn broke with a crispness that promised a clear day after the storm. Wade, still mulling over Nora's surprising display of strength the previous evening, found himself drawn to the chuck wagon. The aroma of coffee and sizzling bacon was already weaving through the camp, a testament to Nora's early rise. He watched her for a moment, her movements fluid and efficient as she navigated the cramped space, a faint melody humming beneath her breath. She seemed entirely at peace, a stark contrast to the ferocity of the storm and her calm mastery of it. Suddenly, the distant thud of hooves broke the morning's serenity. It wasn't the rhythmic canter of a rider on a mission, but a more casual, steady approach. Wade scanned the horizon, his hand instinctively resting on the pistol at his hip. A lone figure, silhouetted against the rising sun, was drawing closer. Too far to discern details, but clearly a stranger. Nora, in the midst of flipping a pancake, froze. The cast-iron pan, still warm from the fire, slipped from her grasp and clattered to the dirt, scattering half-cooked batter across the ground. The humming ceased. Wade watched, puzzled, as she didn't stoop to retrieve it. Instead, her head snapped up, eyes wide and fixed on the approaching rider. A tremor ran through her, subtle at first, then growing more pronounced. Her hands, which only yesterday had so confidently calmed a frightened horse, now trembled uncontrollably. "Nora?" Wade's voice was low, laced with concern. She didn't answer. Her gaze remained glued to the silhouette on the horizon, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The vibrant color drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickly pale. Without a word, she stumbled backward, her eyes darting around the camp as if searching for an escape. Then, With a desperate urgency that shocked Wade to his core, she ducked low behind the chuck wagon, pulling a canvas tarp over herself, effectively vanishing from sight. Wade stood there, dumbfounded. He'd seen men panic in the face of a stampede, but never had he witnessed such raw, visceral terror at the mere sight of a distant rider. He quickly moved to the edge of the wagon, peering over the side. Nora was huddled on the ground, knees drawn to her chest, her face buried in her arms. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. The approaching rider, a lanky cowboy on a dusty bay mare, finally reached the camp. He tipped his hat, a friendly grin on his weathered face. "Morning, boss. Just passing through, saw your smoke. Any chance a man could beg a cup of coffee?" Wade, still reeling from Nora's reaction, managed a tight smile. "Sure thing. Help yourself to the pot." He gestured vaguely toward the fire, his mind racing. He kept his back mostly to the chuck wagon, hoping to shield Nora from view, though the cowboy seemed oblivious. The stranger chatted amiably about the weather and the difficulty of finding good water, completely unaware of the drama unfolding just feet away. Wade offered him a piece of jerky, his attention divided between the polite conversation and the trembling form hidden behind the wagon. After a few minutes, the cowboy thanked him, mounted his horse, and rode off, whistling a jaunty tune. Only when the sound of hooves had faded completely did Nora cautiously emerge from her hiding place. She was still pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but the immediate terror had subsided, replaced by a profound sadness. She picked up the dropped pan, her movements slow and deliberate, avoiding Wade's gaze. "What in tarnation was that, Nora?" Wade asked, his voice softer than he intended. She flinched, then busied herself wiping down the wagon's counter with a damp cloth. Just a moment of weakness, Mr. Carson. I'm sorry. The storm last night, it must have unsettled me more than I thought." Her voice was barely a whisper, a flimsy excuse that didn't even begin to cover the depth of her fear. "Unsettled you? Nora, you looked like you'd seen a ghost," Wade pressed, stepping closer. That was no ordinary reaction to a stranger. She finally met his eyes, and what he saw there stopped him cold. It wasn't just fear. It was a profound, aching sorrow, laced with a weariness that seemed to age her beyond her years. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, suffered too greatly. Some memories are harder to shake than others, Mr. Carson," she said, her voice strained. "Please, just let it be." Wade wanted to push, to demand answers. The image of her trembling form, the raw terror in her eyes, had etched itself into his mind. It wasn't just curiosity. A protective instinct, one he hadn't known he possessed, flared within him. What kind of past could leave a woman so utterly terrified of a lone rider on a prairie? What secrets did she carry, hidden beneath her quiet strength and stunning beauty? He watched her turn back to the breakfast preparations, her hands still trembling slightly as she stirred the coffee. He knew then that the mystery of Nora Bell was far deeper than he'd imagined. And a part of him, against his better judgment, was desperate to uncover it. The trail ahead promised danger from the elements and outlaws, but Wade suddenly realized the greatest peril might lie in the silent battles Nora fought within herself. Respect earned. The rhythmic thud, dud, dud of hooves was a constant companion, a heartbeat of the prairie. Tonight, however, it began to quicken, a subtle tremor through the ground that Wade, even in his sleep, registered. A sharp crack, like a rifle shot in the distance, shattered the fragile piece. Then, a low rumble, growing in intensity, vibrated through his bedroll. "Stampede!" A cowboy's shout tore through the night, raw with alarm. Wade was on his feet instantly, his hand already on the butt of his Colt. The air was thick with the scent of fear and dust, the roar of 1,000 panicked hooves, a deafening wall of sound. He could see the shadowy mass of the herd, a churning river of muscle and horn, breaking loose, scattering across the moonlit plains. The men were already scrambling, mounting their horses, their shouts barely audible above the din. He saw Nora then, not huddled in her wagon, but standing beside it, a rifle clutched in her hands, her eyes wide but resolute. She didn't look like a woman about to flee. She looked like a woman preparing for battle. "Stay put, Nora!" Wade yelled, his voice straining. "It's too dangerous!" She didn't acknowledge him, her gaze fixed on the stampeding cattle. Before he could react, she was moving, not towards the safety of the wagon, but towards the edge of the chaos. She pointed her rifle skyward and fired, the sharp crack cutting through the rumble, a desperate attempt to turn the leading steers. It was a fool's errand, but the audacity of it stunned him. The cowboys, already in the saddle, looked over, their faces a mix of disbelief and exasperation. A woman, a cook, trying to stop a stampede? But Nora wasn't waiting for their approval. She moved with surprising agility, dodging a scattering steer, her long skirts a hindrance, but not a deterrent. She wasn't trying to be a cowboy. She was simply trying to help, her actions born of instinct and a complete disregard for her own safety. She spotted a young calf, separated from its mother, bawling in terror as the larger cattle thundered past. Without a moment's hesitation, Nora dashed forward, scooped up the trembling animal and, cradling it in her arms, began to herd it towards the relative safety of the wagon. The sight was surreal. A delicate woman, a rifle still clutched in one hand, a terrified calf in the other, navigating a maelstrom of charging beasts. Wade spurred his horse, riding hard to cut off a group of strays. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Nora trip, the calf squirming free. She hit the ground hard, rolling once, then scrambling back up, her gaze never leaving the calf. She lunged, grabbed the rope she'd inexplicably had coiled around her shoulder, and lassoed the bewildered animal, pulling it firmly towards the wagon. The cowboys, their initial amusement and frustration fading, watched with dawning admiration. Jed, a grizzled veteran of a dozen drives, let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, wrestling with a particularly stubborn bull. "That woman's got more grit than a whole stable of greenhorns." Slowly, painstakingly, the cowboys began to turn the herd, their coordinated efforts finally making a dent in the chaos. The thunder subsided, replaced by the heavy breathing of the exhausted animals and the shouts of the men. As the last of the strays were brought back into the fold, Wade rode back towards the chuck wagon. Nora was leaning against the wagon wheel, her breathing ragged, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, but her eyes held a fierce light. The calf was safely pinned beside her. "Are you all right?" Wade asked, dismounting. His voice was rougher than he intended, a mix of relief and a lingering frustration at her recklessness. She nodded, pushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Just a little winded." He looked at her, truly looked at her. Her hands, usually so skilled with dough and spices, were scraped and red. Her dress was torn, a long rip exposing a flash of sturdy petticoat. She wasn't the fragile beauty he'd initially perceived. She was something else entirely. The other cowboys began to trickle back, their horses lathered, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. They didn't offer their usual sarcastic remarks or leering glances. Instead, they nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of respect. "Didn't think you had it in you, ma'am," Jed said, his voice devoid of mockery. "Save that little fella, you did." Nora offered a small, tired smile. It needed help. The camaraderie, usually reserved for men who'd faced death together, settled over the camp. The air was thick with it. Wade watched as the men exchanged glances, a silent agreement passing between them. Nora Bell wasn't just the cook anymore. She was one of them. He found himself standing closer to her than he had before, a strange sense of protective warmth spreading through him. The fear he'd seen in her eyes the other day, the inexplicable terror at the sight of a lone rider, still nagged at him. But tonight, he'd seen something else, something fierce and unyielding. And in that moment, in the quiet aftermath of the stampede, Wade felt a pull towards Nora that went beyond mere attraction. It was a recognition of a shared resilience, a silent understanding of the harsh truths of this unforgiving land. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he wanted to know more about the woman who could bake a perfect pie and brave a stampede. The long night stretched ahead, but the stars seemed to burn a little brighter, illuminating the evolving landscape of his heart. The scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee became the comforting backdrop to their evenings. After the last cowboy had rolled into his bedroll, Wade and Nora would linger by the dying embers, the vast, star-peppered sky a silent witness to their quiet conversations. He learned about the small, sun-drenched garden she'd tended as a girl, the way she found solace in the methodical rhythm of baking bread, the dreams she held for a simple life away from, well, she never quite elaborated on what she wanted to be away from. He, in turn, spoke of his early days on the ranch, the stubborn pride he took in a well-executed drive, the quiet ache of solitude that often accompanied his responsibilities. Nora wasn't one for grand pronouncements or dramatic tales. Her stories were woven from small, luminous details, like the particular way light caught the dust motes in her grandmother's kitchen, or the feel of cool river water on bare feet. Wade found himself drawn to the quiet strength beneath her gentle demeanor, a resilience that hinted at depths he was only just beginning to plumb. He watched her hands as she spoke, strong yet graceful, capable of both kneading dough and reloading a rifle with practiced ease. The way her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, would soften when she spoke of a stray dog she'd once nursed back to health, or narrow with a flash of dry humor when recounting a cowboy's outlandish boast. He'd always considered himself a man of practicality, his heart a sturdy, well-worn leather saddle, meant for function, not frivolous adornment. But something about Nora, her quiet grace and unexpected grit, was working its way under his skin. He found himself looking forward to these stolen moments by the fire, the easy rhythm of their talk, the way her laughter, a soft, melodic sound, would echo in the vast silence of the prairie. He appreciated the way she found beauty in the mundane, a perfectly cooked stew, the intricate pattern of frost on a blade of grass, the resolute determination of a lone sunflower. It was a perspective he hadn't realized he was missing, a gentle counterpoint to the rough and tumble world he inhabited. A warmth, unfamiliar yet welcome, began to bloom in his chest, softening the edges of his customary reserve. One evening, as the last sliver of twilight bled from the horizon, a rider appeared in the distance, a solitary silhouette against the deepening purple. It wasn't uncommon for cowboys from neighboring ranches or a lone prospector to pass by, often stopping for coffee or directions. Wade barely registered the approaching figure, his attention still fixed on Nora as she described a childhood memory. Then he felt her stiffen beside him. The easy warmth that had settled between them evaporated, replaced by a sudden, palpable chill. Her hand, which had been resting near his on a discarded coffee cup, trembled slightly. Wade followed her gaze. The rider was still a speck, but Nora's face had gone utterly pale, her eyes wide with an alarm that was more profound than simple apprehension. "Nora?" he murmured, his voice laced with concern. She didn't answer, her breath catching in her throat. Her gaze was locked on the approaching figure, her body rigid as if bracing for an impact. The soft curve of her lips was pulled into a thin, desperate line. "He's looking for me," she whispered, the words barely audible, a ragged gasp of air. Her voice was raw with a terror that sent a cold shiver down Wade's spine. It wasn't the fear of a woman startled by an unexpected visitor. It was the primal, visceral dread of a hunted creature. Wade's instincts flared. The warmth in his chest hardened into a protective wall. He saw the way her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of her skirt, the frantic darting of her eyes, searching for an escape, a place to hide. The quiet, resilient woman he'd come to admire had vanished, replaced by a trembling shell of fear. He reached out, his hand covering hers, a silent anchor. Her skin was cold despite the lingering warmth of the fire. The rider was closer now, close enough for Wade to discern the outline of a broad-brimmed hat, the steady, unhurried pace of his horse. There was something deliberate about the rider's approach, something that didn't feel like a casual detour. "Get behind the chuck wagon," Wade ordered, his voice low and firm, his eyes never leaving the stranger. "Now." Nora didn't argue. She scrambled to her feet, moving with an unnatural swiftness that spoke of pure panic, melting into the shadows cast by the wagon. Wade rose slowly, deliberately, his hand falling to the Colt on his hip. The easy camaraderie of the evening had shattered, replaced by an urgent, dangerous tension. The whispers by the fire had revealed a secret, stark and terrifying. And Wade knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was now irrevocably bound to protect her. The secret unveiled. Nora's breath hitched, the image of the rider seared behind her eyelids. She'd tried to dismiss him, to rationalize the flicker of recognition, but her gut screamed a warning she couldn't ignore. The fear, a cold knot in her stomach, had been building since her arrival, a constant companion she'd mastered at suppressing. Now it threatened to consume her. She found Wade by the flickering light of the campfire, cleaning his rifle, his brow furrowed in concentration. The other wranglers were long asleep, their snores a steady rhythm against the rustle of the prairie grass. She sat opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the silence stretching between them until it felt taut. "Wade?" Her voice was a thin whisper, barely audible above the crackle of the flames. He looked up, his eyes, usually so sharp and assessing, softened as they met hers. "Nora? What is it?" The concern in his tone was a balm, a small comfort in the vast ocean of her terror. I have to tell you something," She swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. That rider. I think he saw me. Wade set his rifle aside, his full attention now on her. Who was he, Nora? His voice was gentle, but his gaze was unwavering. The confession spilled out, a torrent of long-held secrets. His name is Elias Thorne. He believes I belong to him. Her voice trembled with a raw vulnerability she rarely allowed to surface. He's a powerful man, Wade. Wealthy, influential. He controls everything and everyone around him. He claims he owns me, that I'm his property. Wade's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Claims you? What in God's name are you talking about? He's ruthless, obsessive. When I tried to leave to make a life for myself, he sent men after me. He said he would hunt me down, no matter where I went. He vows to brand me, to make sure everyone knows I'm his. The last words were barely audible, laced with a humiliation that made her flinch. I've been running for 2 years, Wade. Changing my name, moving from town to town. I thought I was safe out here, in the middle of nowhere. A sob caught in her throat. If he finds me, he'll destroy me. The campfire light flickered across Wade's face, illuminating the stark lines of his concern. He reached across and covered her clasped hands with his own, his touch firm and reassuring. He won't touch you, Nora. Not while I'm around. His gaze met hers, fierce and resolute. I don't care who this man is, he won't lay a hand on you. We'll protect you. A fragile hope sparked within her, a flickering flame against the encroaching darkness. She believed him. She had to. The next morning dawned with a leaden sky, a prelude to the troubles ahead. The air hung heavy and humid, a suffocating blanket that pressed down on the vast expanse of the prairie. The river, usually a placid ribbon of silver, was swollen and turbulent, its banks churning with muddy water. The previous night's distant storm had turned it into a roaring torrent. Looks like she's high and mighty, Jedediah, one of the older wranglers, grumbled, spitting tobacco juice into the churning current. Might lose a few head if we ain't careful. Wade surveyed the raging water, his expression grim. We'll cross slowly, spread the cattle out. Keep the lead steers pointed upstream. No rushing, no panic. He turned to Nora, his voice softening slightly. You ride with me, Nora. Stay close. The crossing was a brutal ordeal. The current snatched at the cattle, threatening to sweep them downstream. The air filled with the panicked bellowing of the herd and the shouted commands of the wranglers. Nora clung to her saddle, her heart pounding against her ribs as the water swirled around her horse's belly. She saw one young steer lose its footing, dragged under by the relentless current, its desperate cries quickly silenced. Wade, his face set in a mask of determination, rode back and forth, urging on the struggling animals, his powerful voice cutting through the din. They emerged on the far bank, drenched and exhausted, but with most of the herd accounted for. Relief washed over Nora, quickly replaced by a new dread as they faced the next obstacle, a narrow pass winding through a jagged, rocky outcrop. The trail was barely wide enough for a single steer, with sheer rock walls rising on either side. Dust, churned up by the cattle, hung in the air, creating a hazy, claustrophobic atmosphere. The cattle, already agitated from the river crossing, grew restless, their hooves clattering ominously on the loose stones. Keep 'em moving, but slow, Wade ordered, his voice tight with tension. Any rock slide in here and we're buried. Nora rode behind him, her eyes scanning the precarious slopes above. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every shifting stone a prelude to disaster. The air was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and fear. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the dangers of the trail were far from over. And somewhere out there, lurking in the shadows, was Elias Thorne, a human predator more terrifying than any stampede or flash flood. A choice to make. The sun, a nascent sliver on the eastern rim, painted the dusty plain with exaggerated silhouettes of cattle and riders. Wade, leading the drive, his gaze a restless current over the terrain, weighed the perils of the looming river crossing. The recent deluge had swollen the water into a churning menace, a formidable barrier even without the specter of Elias Thorne's imminent arrival. A maelstrom of conflicting loyalties churned in his gut. Every instinct screamed to shield Nora, to spirit her far from the monster she'd described. Yet the herd was his burden, the drive his sacred trust. 100 men's livelihoods hinged on him. The venture's triumph rested on his broad shoulders. He was a trail boss, not a storybook knight. But the phantom of Nora's terrified gaze, the quaver in her voice recounting Thorne's brand, burned a searing image in his mind, eclipsing the cattle's lowing, the creak of leather, the rhythmic thud of hooves. He twisted in the saddle, his eyes seeking the chuck wagon, a dark smudge against the brightening sky. Nora would be stirring now, the scent of coffee and sizzling bacon likely mingling with damp earth and the bovine aroma. A part of him yearned to ride back, to offer reassurance, to promise her safety. But he couldn't. Not yet. First the river, then the narrow pass beyond. Only then could he truly weigh his options. Cowboys nudged the reluctant cattle toward the riverbank, their shouts echoing in the morning quiet. The lead steers balked at the rushing water, apprehension wide in their eyes. Ropes whistled as the men urged them onward. Wade dismounted, passing his reins to a nearby rider, then waded into the shallows. The icy grip of the current swirled around his boots. Strong, but manageable. He glanced back at the chuck wagon, a silent plea for fortitude. Suddenly, a raw, guttural cry, sharp as a hawk's shriek, tore through the air. Wade's head snapped up. On the ridge overlooking the river, silhouetted against the nascent sun, a lone rider materialized. Behind him, a half-dozen more emerged, their forms indistinct in the glare. The lead rider, a stocky man in a wide-brimmed hat, spurred his horse forward, descending the slope with reckless abandon. "Nora Bell!" The man's roar carried clearly across the distance. "You belong to me!" Wade's blood ran cold. Elias Thorne. The name was a whip crack in the stillness, a primal surge of fury, a protective instinct he hadn't known lay dormant, ignited within him. His eyes darted to the chuck wagon. Nora stood frozen, a tin cup clutched in her hand. Her face, usually serene, was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that clawed at Wade's heart. It was a raw, visceral fear, confirming his darkest suspicions. This was no jilted lover, no disgruntled employer. This was something far more sinister. The cowboys, momentarily diverted by the sudden appearance of the riders, paused their efforts to cross the herd. A murmur rippled through the ranks. Some recognized the name, others simply sensed the danger radiating from the approaching figures. Thorne, now closer, reined in his horse, his gaze locked on Nora. A cruel, possessive grin stretched across his face. "Come here, little bird," he sneered, his voice dripping malice. "Time to come home." Nora remained motionless, paralyzed, her body stiffened, breath caught in her throat. The tin cup slipped from her grasp, landing with a dull thud in the dirt. Her eyes, fixed on Thorn, mirrored pure, unadulterated dread. Wade stood in the river, the cold water swirling around his thighs, but felt only a searing heat of rage. His hand clamped around the hilt of his revolver, knuckles white. The cattle, sensing the tension, grew restless, their lowing growing louder, more urgent. The river crossing, the entire drive, suddenly seemed inconsequential. All that mattered was the woman by the chuck wagon, clearly in mortal peril. His mind raced, grappling with impossible choices. Charge Thorn and his men, risking the herd and his cowboys' lives, or abandon Nora to her fate, complete the drive, and condemn her to a horror he couldn't fathom. The decision felt like a brand being seared into his own flesh. There was no right answer, only a choice between two unbearable outcomes. Thorn dismounted, slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving Nora. He began to stalk towards her, a predator closing on its prey. Nora's knees buckled. She swayed precariously, her hand reaching out as if to steady herself against an unseen wall. The sight ignited a spark in Wade, a cold, hard resolve that solidified his decision. He drew his revolver, the click of the hammer echoing in the sudden silence. The cowboys turned, eyes wide with surprise. Wade didn't care. His gaze was locked on Thorn, his voice ringing out across the plain, laced with an authority that brooked no argument. "That's far enough, Thorn." Thorn stopped, his head slowly turning towards Wade. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, swiftly replaced by a smug sneer. "You meddling fool. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me now," Wade retorted, his voice low and dangerous. "She's with me." The words hung in the air, a challenge, a declaration. The cattle drive, the thousands of dollars, the months of planning, it all faded into the background. Wade Carson, trail boss, had made his choice. The standoff and the fight. The roar of the river, usually a comforting constant, became a furious backdrop to the sudden silence that fell between the two factions. Wade stood before Nora, his back to her, a shield of muscle and defiance. His revolver, heavy and resolute, was leveled at Silas, whose sneer had hardened into a dangerous mask. "She's with me," Wade repeated, his voice low, a tremor of fury beneath the calm. "Turn around, Silas. Ride away." Silas let out a harsh laugh, a sound that grated against the tension. "Now, Carson, you know that ain't how this works. You just lost your mind. Or did the pretty little thing charm it right out of your head?" He gestured vaguely at Nora, his eyes glinting with a predatory interest. "She belongs to Thorn. You interfere, you'll regret it." Wade's thumb brushed the hammer of his revolver. "I'm not asking twice." The air crackled, thick with unspoken threats. On Wade's side, his cowboys, though outnumbered, had their hands hovering near their own holsters, their faces grim. On Silas's side, Thorn's men spread out, forming a semicircle, their movements fluid and practiced, like wolves circling prey. Then a shot rang out. It wasn't from Wade. It was from one of Silas's men, aimed not at Wade, but at the ground near one of Wade's cowboys. A deliberate provocation. The cowboy instinctively drew, and the fight exploded. The peaceful riverside, moments before a scene of quiet labor, erupted into a maelstrom of shouts, gunshots, and the clang of metal. Wade's cowboys, though fewer, fought with a desperate ferocity, fueled by loyalty in the suddenness of the attack. Fists flew, dust plumed from the dry earth, and the smell of gunpowder mingled with the sharp scent of fear. Wade, momentarily distracted by the chaos engulfing his men, found himself face to face with Silas. Silas, a burly man with a cruel smile, didn't bother with a gun. He lunged, a thick-knuckled fist arcing for Wade's jaw. Wade ducked, the blow whistling past his ear, and countered with a swift jab to Silas's gut. The larger man grunted but barely stumbled, his eyes alight with a cold, brutal joy. This wasn't just a fight, it was a personal vendetta for Silas, a chance to prove his dominance. Wade's revolver was useless at this range, so he dropped it, trusting his fists. He parried another blow, feeling the jarring impact against his forearm, and delivered a powerful hook that connected solidly with Silas's temple. Silas reeled, his eyes momentarily glazing over, but he quickly recovered, spitting a stream of blood and a curse. The fight was a blur of motion and raw violence. Wade heard the sharp cracks of rifles, the thud of bodies, the desperate cries of his men. He knew they were outmatched, but they fought on, a testament to their loyalty. He landed another blow to Silas's jaw, staggering him, and tried to create some distance, glancing quickly toward Nora. He expected to see her cowering, perhaps even fleeing, her earlier terror a stark memory. What he saw instead shocked him to his core. Nora, her face pale but set with a grim determination he'd never witnessed, was not hiding. She had snatched a rifle from the back of the chuck wagon, a long gun she must have known how to handle, and without a moment's hesitation, she raised it to her shoulder. The rifle cracked, loud and sharp, and one of Thorne's men, who had been advancing on a cowboy, stumbled and fell, clutching his leg. Wade stared, momentarily stunned. Nora, the woman he'd believed to be fragile and easily terrified, was fighting. She reloaded with surprising speed, her movements economical and precise, and fired again, her aim true. Another of Thorne's men cried out, his arm suddenly useless. "Nora!" Wade yelled, a mix of disbelief and fierce pride in his voice. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed, scanning the chaotic scene for targets. Her eyes, usually soft and shadowed, now held a steely glint, a dangerous fire. She moved from the relative cover of the wagon, stepping into the open, a formidable figure with the rifle held steady. She wasn't just defending herself. She was fighting for them, for him. Her sudden, unexpected intervention shifted the tide, if only slightly. Thorne's men, momentarily disoriented by the woman with the rifle, hesitated. It was enough. Wade, renewed by Nora's incredible display of courage, redoubled his efforts against Silas. He saw an opening, a momentary lapse in Silas's guard, and delivered a brutal uppercut that snapped Silas's head back. The big man staggered, his legs giving out, and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Wade, breathing heavily, wiped a trickle of blood from his lip and scanned the battlefield. Nora was still firing, her shots spaced, deliberate, and effective. The cowboys, seeing her fighting alongside them, found new strength, their roars of defiance echoing across the river. The standoff had become a full-blown battle, and in its heart, Nora Bell, the quiet cook, had transformed into a warrior. A new beginning. Nora's rifle cracked, a sharp, metallic punctuation marking Silas's stunned realization. His men, already reeling from the cowboy's unexpected stand and Wade's furious charge, faltered, their bravado evaporating under the sudden onslaught. Nora, reloading with fluid grace, fired again, her bullet kissing the brim of a desperado's hat, a chillingly precise warning shot. "Back off!" Wade's roar, raw with adrenaline, ripped through the air. "Or you'll regret it!" Silas, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, spat orders at his dwindling crew. But their spirit was broken. The image of the cook woman wielding a rifle with such deadly accuracy had shattered their illusion of an easy conquest. They scattered, some scrambling for their mounts, others simply vanishing into the dense undergrowth. Silas, jaw clenched in a snarl, cast a venomous glare at Nora before vaulting onto his horse and galloping away, his retreat a stark admission of unexpected defeat. Silence descended, punctuated only by the ragged breaths of men and horses. Wade stared at Nora, his chest heaving, a cocktail of awe and something akin to apprehension swirling in his eyes. She stood, rifle still in hand, her gaze unwavering, not a muscle twitching. "Nora," he rasped, his voice hoarse. She met his gaze, then slowly lowered the rifle. "He won't be back," she stated, her voice surprisingly calm, though a faint tremor of exhaustion ran through it. The cowboys, now gathering, exchanged glances between Nora and Wade, their expressions a blend of respect and utter astonishment. Jeb, a grizzled old hand, spat on the ground. "Well, I'll be damned. Never thought I'd see the day a woman outshot a whole pack of ruffians." Nora drew a deep breath, her eyes sweeping over the faces of the cowboys before settling on Wade's. "Silas isn't just a bandit, Wade," she began, her voice gaining strength, each word delivered with deliberate weight. "He's Elias Thorne's enforcer. He's been hounding me for months, trying to drag me back. Thorne, he believes he owns me. He threatened to kill anyone who helped me." Her voice wavered slightly, but her eyes held firm. "He's a powerful, cruel man, and he'll stop at nothing." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cowboys. The implications hung heavy in the air. This was no longer just a cattle drive. It was about a woman fleeing a formidable enemy, and they had just unwittingly stepped into the crosshairs. Wade moved closer, his hand gently touching her arm. "You should have told me, Nora." She flinched at his touch, then looked him square in the eye. "I couldn't. I didn't want to put you or your men in danger. I've been running from Thorne for too long, always looking over my shoulder." Her voice cracked, releasing the raw emotion she'd kept buried. "He's relentless. He destroyed everything I had simply because I wouldn't be his possession." A deep fury simmered in Wade's chest. He surveyed the anxious faces of his crew. "We're not letting him get away with it," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "No one owns anyone." The final stretch of the cattle drive was a blur of dust, sweat, and grim resolve. The cowboys, now acutely aware of the stakes, pushed the herd with a renewed sense of purpose. Nora, though visibly weary, continued her duties, her quiet strength a steadfast anchor. Wade, however, rarely left her side, his gaze often lingering on her, a silent promise etched in his eyes. They reached the railhead town, a bustling nexus of activity, beneath a sky streaked with the vibrant hues of sunset. The weary cattle were guided into pens, the cacophony of their lowing a welcome symphony of completion. The men, exhausted but triumphant, cheered, their arduous labor finally yielding its reward. As the last steer was counted, Wade found Nora by the chuck wagon, cleaning pots with methodical efficiency. He watched her for a moment, the setting sun casting a golden sheen on her hair. "We did it, Nora," he said softly, approaching her. She turned, a small, tired smile gracing her lips. "We did." He reached out, taking her hands, his touch warm and firm. "Thorn won't find you here. Not with me." Her eyes, usually so guarded, softened, a flicker of hope kindling within them. "You mean that?" "Every word," he affirmed, his thumb gently caressing her knuckles. "This life, this trail, it's a hard one, Nora, but it's a free one, and I want to share it with you. No more running, no more fear, just you and me." A tear escaped her eye, tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "Wade." "I love you, Nora Bell," he said, his voice thick with emotion, the words a dam finally bursting. "And I want to build a life with you, here, wherever here ends up being. A life where you're safe and you're mine in all the right ways." She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, the scent of leather and earth a comforting embrace. "I love you too, Wade Carson," she whispered, her voice choked with relief and a burgeoning joy. "More than I ever thought possible." The future remained uncertain, shadowed by unknowns and the lingering specter of Elias Thorne. But as Wade held Nora close, beneath the vast, star-dusted western sky, a profound sense of peace settled over him. They had faced down danger, unveiled hidden truths, and forged a bond stronger than any threat. Together, they would build their new beginning, one step at a time, free and unafraid.